Today we're talking about Seventh Day Adventists. This is the Lost Mission Podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. My name is Don Van Zant, and this is the Lost Mission Podcast, where our goal is to help us as believers get back to our mission of knowing and sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us today. So this is our series on cults and fringe groups. A cult, if you remember from our other videos, is kind of difficult to define. We may ask our questions, or ask ourselves the question, what exactly is a cult? Well, Walter Martin defines a cult this way in his book, The Kingdom of the Cults. He defines a cult as any religious group which differs significantly in one or more respects as to belief or practice from those religious groups which are regarded as the normative expressions of religion in our total culture. Or to put it a bit more simply, when we talk about a cult, we're going to think of a cult as a group that extends far beyond what we would view as orthodox or as orthodoxy. But some groups we discuss may not necessarily just fall right into that category of a cult. But they also don't fall directly into what we would consider to be orthodox. So we would consider them as more of a fringe group. Today's group, the Seventh Day Adventists, would be a group that we look at that way. More of a fringe group, not a cult, maybe not strictly orthodox, but definitely not a cult. But who are the Seventh Day Adventists? Now look, I could give you a definition, but why don't we just hear it from the group themselves? Here's what the Seventh Day Adventists have to say about themselves.
You might be asking, who are Seventh Day Adventists? Commonly known as Adventists, we are a Christian movement established in 1863. We have 28 fundamental beliefs and more than 20 million members. We also observe the Seventh-day Sabbath. Worldwide, we have more than 162,000 congregations. We serve countless communities with our education institutions, with 2 million students. And 198 hospitals around the world. And it's all because we love Jesus.
So that's directly from Seventh Day Adventists, taken from their YouTube channel, and what they have to say, how they sort of define themselves. But who are some famous Seventh Day Adventists? As with many religious groups, there's some recognizable names and faces. Here are a few. Rapper Busta Rhymes, 2.5 Men star from the TV show 2.5 Men, Angus T. Jones, NBA Hall of Famer Magic Johnson. He's actually struggled with his sort of Seventh-day Adventist heritage and seems somewhat friendly toward the group, so he at least has ties to them. Singer Little Richard, Cheryl Renee James of the rap duo Salt and Peppa. She is the Salt of Salt and Peppa. And probably most recognizable Seventh-day Adventists, when we think of those that are popular within the group, names and faces, former presidential candidate Ben Carson. So Seventh-day Adventists are part of a long list of 19th and sort of early 20th century Christian movements that fall very closely to that category of a cult. Some may fall directly into the category that we would consider a cult, but definitely close to it. Now, are they a cult? Like I said at the top of the video, I don't believe that they are. I would not consider Seventh-day Adventists to be a cult. I would consider them actually to be my brothers and sisters in Christ. But would I say that they are just an orthodox Christian group? No, I don't think that I would say that either. But, before we want to just place all these labels onto them, passing judgment onto them, and those of us who are not within or a part of the group decide their fate for them. I don't really know that that's our job to do anyway, but let's talk about them a little bit. Let's discuss their history before we just make a rash judgment of them. Let's get some context, all right? So the history of Seventh Day Adventism. When most people think of the history of Seventh Day Adventism, they think of one person, Ellen G. White. And while she is technically one of the co-founders of Seventh Day Adventism, we really need to back the clock up a little bit further and look a little bit earlier in time and in history to another individual who would be sort of the foundation for the group. And his name is William Miller. Who was William Miller? Well, William Miller is really a man that is considered not just the founder of what would become Seventh-day Adventism, but the founder of Adventism in general, of the entire group of Adventism. So there are not just Seventh-day Adventists, there are actually many and several Adventist groups that exist within the larger body of Adventism. Let me pull this graphic up onto the screen, and I will actually show you a few different Adventist groups. Okay, so we see on this purple line here William Miller and the Adventists, or the Millerites. On this purple line, they began in around 1844, 1845. At the very top of the line is the group that we're going to be discussing today, the Seventh-day Adventists. If you look on this middle gray line, it's kind of difficult to see, but you see Russell and the Bible students. That is actually where the Jehovah's Witnesses would arise from, having their connections back to Miller and the Adventists through the Advent Christian Church and through the First Day Adventists. Now, the Advent Christian Church is still in existence. I don't know a lot about them. I don't know that they are necessarily something that we should be nervous about. But there are ties back to Jehovah's Witnesses and William Miller through the Advent Christian movement. All the way down at the bottom, you see the Christadelphians, who likely also influenced Charles Taze Russell and the Jehovah's Witnesses, but we're not here to discuss the Jehovah's Witnesses today. I just want us to understand where these groups came from. Now, the very top red line, again, if you were to look at that, and that line were to extend a bit further, you would actually see that there's a group referred to as the Branch Davidians that exists as another branch off of Seventh-day Adventism, and David Koresh and his group in Mount Carmel actually came out of the Branch Davidians. So they were a very strong Seventh-day Adventist group. They were the extremes of the group, just as much as Charles Taze Russell and the Seventh-day, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, were the extreme of the group. But we're not talking about the extremes today. We want to talk about the Seventh-day Adventists, but we need to understand a little bit about Adventism. So William Miller, the founder of Adventism, what were his origins? Where did he come from? Who is this guy? He was born in 1782 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Miller was seemingly a sort of everyman type of his day, a farmer, not much to speak of. He didn't have a great education, never attended seminary, didn't gain a theological training or degree. He was just an average, everyday guy. There is one thing of note about William Miller that I personally found interesting. He was actually the son of a veteran of the Revolutionary War. So William Miller, you can see how Seventh-day Adventism or how Adventism goes all the way back almost to the founding of the country, with William Miller's father actually fighting in the Revolutionary War. And William Miller himself joins the military. He fights as a lieutenant in the War of 1812. And it was during this time in the military that Miller's sort of spiritual awakening began to take place. He becomes a deist. Now, a deist is one that really kind of believes that God doesn't have just a whole lot. They do believe in God, but they don't believe that God has a lot to do with the world. He basically created things, set them in motion, and then didn't have a lot else to do after that. I would say that William Miller's deist views were likely spawned from his involvement in the war, seeing trauma, seeing pain, seeing death. And so he must have believed, well, there must be a God, but I don't think he has much to do with the world. That's my opinion, for what opinions are worth. He lives as a deist for about 4 years until 1816, when he converts to become a Baptist minister. And once he becomes a Baptist minister, William Miller really begins to take his Bible study much more seriously. And he begins to, quote, search the scriptures. Now remember, Miller had not received a formal theological education. And when he begins to search the scriptures, he doesn't have this education to depend on. He also doesn't consult major scholarship of his day. What he does, he has his Bible and he has his Cruden's Concordance. Now, if I am correct, even the Strong's Concordance wasn't written until sometime after William Miller does his studies. He has his Cruden's Concordance to rely on. But how did he study the Bible? Okay, as he began to study the Bible, he became very focused on the apocalyptic text of Scripture, very focused on eschatology and the events of the end time. And he was so convinced of his studies that he actually began to believe that the main thrust of Scripture, the main idea when you would read the Bible is concerning the end time, that it actually revolves around the idea of eschatology. It was somehow related to end time events. And if a person could properly interpret several key passages, one passage in particular, but several key passages, they could actually predict the very day upon which Christ would return. But what was Miller's prediction? As he studies, he comes to this passage in the book of Daniel. And this passage in Daniel, it almost stops Miller dead in his tracks. He becomes captivated by this passage. It encapsulates his thinking. And the verse that gets him is Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. It says this, "And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." And in William Miller's own words, here's what he has to say. "From a further study of the Scripture, I concluded that the 7 times of the Gentile supremacy must commence when the Jews cease to be an independent nation at the captivity of Manasseh, which the best chronologers assign to BC 677. That the 2,300 days commenced with the 70 weeks, which the best chronologers dated from BC 457, and that the 1,335 days commencing up with the taking away of the daily and the setting up of the abomination that maketh desolate in Daniel 12:11 were to be dated from the setting up of the papal supremacy after the taking away of pagan abominations, and which, according to the best historians I could consult, should be dated from about AD 508. Reckoning all these prophetic periods from the several dates assigned by the best chronologers for the events, from which they should evidently be reckoned, they would all terminate together about AD 1843. I was thus brought in 1818, at the close of my 2 years' study of the Scriptures, to the solemn conclusion that in about 25 years from that time, all the affairs of our present state would be wound up, that all its pride and power, pomp and vanity, wickedness and oppression would come to an end, and that, in the place of the kingdoms of this world, the peaceful and long-desired kingdom of the Messiah would be established under the whole heaven, that, in about 25 years, the glory of the Lord would be revealed, and all flesh see it together. The desert bud and blossom as the rose, the fir tree come up instead of the thorn, and instead of the briar, the myrtle tree. The curse be removed from off the earth, death be destroyed, reward be given to the servants of God, the prophets and saints, and to them who fear his name, and those be destroyed that destroy the earth." Those are honestly very powerful words from William Miller. But from 2 years of study, he arrives at this conclusion. And after arriving at this conclusion, upon coming to this conclusion, he's a bit hesitant to speak on his views at the first. I'm sure there are many reasons. One is that Miller didn't really believe himself to be some great public speaker. He would actually, I believe, refer back to Moses and Aaron, to that story, how that Moses was afraid to speak and speak of himself in the same way. But also, it was undoubtedly an issue that William Miller would have thought that people just must think he's crazy for saying something like this. But eventually, he did begin to share his views. And surprisingly, people listened to what he had to say. He developed a following, and his followers became known as what were called Millerites, and these Millerites were later referred to as Adventists. So the Millerites made a few subtle changes to Miller's prediction and ultimately landing on the final day that Jesus was going to return on October 22nd, 1844. And as his group looked forward to this day with great anticipation and with great expectation, there was a bit of skepticism, I'm sure, that existed surrounding the Millerites and their view. And so finally, the day arrived, October 22nd, 1844. And there was so much anticipation in the air. Some nervously made their way through the day as the day dawned and the morning wore on. They prayed, they sung songs, they sang hymns. They looked forward as mid-morning turned into midday, into the afternoon. Midday wore on and eventually turned into dusk and into evening. Evening transitioned over into night as the sun began to set. And then late into the late night hours, finally 11:59 p.m. rolls around. And the clock ticks over to the next day, October 23rd, 1844. Nothing happens. Now, the Millerites were dismayed. They were confused. They were disappointed. As a matter of fact, this event would later on go to be known as what was referred to as the Great Disappointment. So obviously 1843 and 1844 came and went. Christ didn't return. The Millerites are shocked. They become sort of a laughingstock to the community. They're discouraged. Their numbers start to fall off a little bit. Folks doubt William Miller and his prophecy and his predictions. And there's one man within the group that acts as almost a saving grace. But before I speak about him, here's a quote from William Miller and what he had to say. He said this some weeks after the Great Disappointment. "I confess my error and acknowledge my disappointment. Yet I still believe that the day of the Lord is near, even at the door. But there was this man who the very following day, on October the 23rd, 1844, he woke up with a different disposition than the others who were dismayed and fearful. His name was Hiram Edson. Hiram Edson woke up and knew that they needed to deal with the fallout from this failed prophecy and from this false prediction. And so what Hiram Edson does, he gathers a few men together. They have a small prayer meeting in a barn. And at the end of the prayer, he leaves the barn and walks out through a field. And something very interesting happens to Hiram Edson. Hiram Edson doesn't claim that he has a vision. He doesn't claim that Christ appears to him. He doesn't claim that an angel gives him some revelation or some great prophecy. He has more of an epiphany than anything. He develops this idea of how they can reconcile the prediction of 1844 with the book of Daniel, with the prophecies, how this can all come together. Okay, so all is not lost. The morning after the Great Disappointment, Hiram Edson is praying, and after his time of prayer, he's walking through the open field, and he has this very surreal experience. Here's a couple of quotes from Hiram Edson. "While I was thus standing in the midst of the field, my comrade passed on almost beyond speaking distance before missing me. He inquired why I was stopping so long. I replied, the Lord was answering our morning prayer by giving light with regard to our disappointment." Another quote. "After breakfast, I said to one of my brethren, 'Let us go on and see, and encourage some of our brethren.' We started, and while passing through a large field, I was stopped about midway of the field. Heaven seemed open to my view, and I saw distinctly and clearly that instead of our high priest coming out of the most holy of the heavenly sanctuary to come to this earth on the 10th day of the 7th month at the end of the 2300 days, that he for the first time entered on that day the second apartment of that sanctuary, and that he had a work to perform in the most holy before coming to this earth. That he came to the marriage at that time, as mentioned in the parable of the 10 virgins. In other words, to the Ancient of Days, to receive a kingdom, dominion, and glory, and we must wait for his return from the wedding." And it's from this experience in the field by Hiram Edson that the beginning of one of the most popular Seventh-day Adventist doctrines was developed. The doctrine of the investigative judgment. More on that later, though. So what happens with Hiram Edson? Hiram Edson has this vision, or has this epiphany, and he begins to tell the Millerites that, look, William Miller, he got it right in that he predicted the right date, but he predicted the wrong event. Instead of Jesus coming from heaven down into earth, rather, what the prediction was, according to William Miller and according to Hiram Edson, was that Jesus actually would stay in heaven and make a move within heaven itself into the most holy place and begin this sort of investigative judgment, and they would build a whole doctrine sort of surrounding this. It feels like a workaround to me. It feels like that they missed it and they needed to find some way to reconcile their beliefs and their ideals. Seventh-day Adventists may disagree on that, but it does feel that way. In December of that same year, a young, devoted Millerite woman has the first of many visions, over 2,000 visions actually. She's dealing with the fallout surrounding the Great Disappointment. Herself and many of her friends are gathered together in a small prayer meeting in a small home, and while they're praying, this young woman, in a vision, begins to see herself lifted off of the floor, begins to levitate, begins to go above the house, up into the sky, into the heavens, and as she goes up, she looks down and she sees all of her Adventist brothers and sisters, and she looks down and sees the Adventist folks that are still on the road to heaven, but many, because of their doubt, because of their confusion, they've left the road and they have left the way to heaven. This young woman's name was Ellen G. White. And Ellen G. White becomes one of the co-founders of Seventh-day Adventism. And it's because of this first vision where she looks down and sees some on the road, on the right path, on the Adventist path toward heaven, that they've still got it right. But those that have doubted and have fallen away are no longer on the path toward heaven. But who is Ellen G. White, and what is her role within the church? Well, it was because of visions like this first vision that Ellen White would rise to great prominence within the Seventh-day Adventist group. And to this day, she is still regarded as a prophetess by Seventh-day Adventists, from Adventist.org on prophecy. This gift is an identifying mark of the remnant church, and we believe it was manifested in the ministry of Ellen G. White. Her writings speak with prophetic authority and provide comfort, guidance, instruction, and correction to the church. So Ellen G. White, how many prophecies did she have? How many do we have recorded? Well, in addition to her 2,000 visions, she has authored somewhere between 40 and 80, maybe even over 100 books, hundreds of flyers, as many as 5,000 different articles on various different topics. They may not all necessarily be prophetic in nature, but the topics range from health to the Sabbath, to parenting, stewardship, marriage and relationships, prophecy, and yes, of course, eschatology and the end times. Ellen G. White is very important to the Seventh-day Adventist movement. Very important. Possibly the most influential, most important figure within the group at all to this day. But was she the leader of the Seventh-day Adventist organization? So here's the point. It's worth noting that Ellen G. White was not the leader of the group. When the church was organized in 1863, it was not Ellen White who was selected as the leader, but rather her husband, James White. Not that James White. That it was selected as the president of the organization. And upon organization of the group, women did seem to take a little bit more of a back seat. They were not quite as prominent, but Ellen did still function as an evangelist, as a prophetess within the group. The men, James White and Joseph Bates, began to run the organization, and Ellen White was more of in the background of the group. but still yet very influential, very powerful within them, still prophesying, still writing books, still giving advice, still having visions. And naturally, as with any group, as it begins to form, as it begins to sort of gel and to come together, there's an element of competition that begins to exist. They see Ellen White and her popularity, they see her influence, and I'm certain that Ellen White was the hero of many young Seventh-day Adventist women. But Ellen White didn't take too kindly to competition. There are a few instances of those that would arise to not necessarily challenge Ellen G. White's authority, but maybe to sort of want to emulate her and want to be like her. A few of them, one in particular, Anna Garmeyer, claimed that visions and prophecies surrounding the year 1884, which Ellen White quickly rejects and throws out Anna Garmeyer's theories. She authors a tract, and that tract is entitled An Exposure of Fanaticism and Wickedness, aimed specifically at Anna Garmeyer. That shuts down Anna Garmeyer's influence within the group. Later on, Ellen G. White takes a trip down south. I believe she goes to Australia to perform some ministry work down there, and she's going to be there for quite some time. So while she's out of the States, another young woman begins to prophesy, and her influence begins to really take a little bit of hold. Anna Phillips begins to prophesy, and some folks within the group begin to listen and take note of what she is saying, until finally the words of Anna Phillips and her influence makes its way back to Ellen G. White in Australia, and Ellen G. White is a bit more kind to Anna Phillips than she was to Anna Garmeyer. Anna Garmeyer, she just completely shuts off. But she just kind of looks at the young Anna Phillips and says, well, she's just young and she's energetic, doesn't really know what she's talking about. She's very dismissive, and kind of shuts down Anna Phillips in a much kinder way. There's also an issue that I don't fully understand all of the details with, so I'm not really going to try to weigh in on it, but she had a secretary, Fanny Bolton, that worked for her, who also claimed some sort of prophetic revelation that when she would do this, Ellen G. White didn't want to hear it. She actually fired her from her being her secretary on 3 separate occasions. So I guess she would prophesy. Ellen G. White didn't like it. She would fire her, hire her back, and they went through this song and dance 3 different times. Ellen G. White didn't really like competition, and I don't mean to paint Ellen G. White as some tyrannical influence and that she was just trying to squash everybody who tried to have any power outside of her, but there's no doubt that she didn't want people to compete with her. But today, Seventh-day Adventists still hold Ellen G. White in very high regard. To this day, she's viewed as a prophetess, despite many of her own false teachings, which we will discuss at a later time. Despite her views that were likely wrong, they still hold White in very, very high regard. But modern-day Seventh-day Adventists, it does appear that the church has and is continuing to go through a sort of growth. As a matter of fact, Seventh-day Adventists make it plain, make it clear that they don't have all of the answers, that they don't know everything, and they are open to the idea of learning and of growing and of transitioning. And so what it comes down to is if they find proof that one of their held beliefs, they have 28 fundamental beliefs, if one of their held beliefs is absolutely incorrect, they will change. And I appreciate that. That is one of the greatest marks of the group. And I think that's what keeps them out of cult territory. And that's what keeps them moving and venturing closer and closer toward orthodoxy all the time. This growth and this evolution, this change of opinion and of view. Let me give us one example. For example, they adopted the doctrine of the Trinity as an official belief in 1980. So not so long ago, less than 40 or so years, I guess, 41 years ago now, they actually adopted officially the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, they had unofficially adopted it, I want to say, around 1930, but prior to that, they were not a Trinitarian group. But slowly over time, the doctrine of the Trinity made its way into the group. Matter of fact, one of their college professors, George R. Knight, has this to say about Seventh-day Adventism. Most of the founders of Seventh-day Adventism would not be able to join the church today if they had to subscribe to the denomination's fundamental beliefs. So even their own people know that their founders would not agree with them as they are today. Why? Because the group has grown. And I do appreciate that. And that's good news to hear. This gradual change and shift of perspective, it really gives me great hope that Seventh-day Adventists will stay on the trajectory that they're on, that they will keep moving forward and come toward an orthodox position and stance. So are they a cult? I don't think so. Are they orthodox? Not yet. Are they moving in the right direction? Absolutely they are. We haven't gotten into much of their beliefs today. That's for another video. But guys, that's going to do it for this one. That's a quick, brief overview of the history and some early influencers within Seventh-day Adventism. But that's it for this one. Guys, grace and peace, and I will catch you later.